So I want to start with Acts chapter 9, verse 31.
Počet ću sa Djela Apostolska 9. poglavlje.
So you can go ahead and read Acts 9:31, yeah.
Od 31. redka.
31. 9:31. Just one verse.
Znači Djela Apostolska 9. poglavlje, 31. redak. Tako su crkve po svoj Judeji i Galileji i Samariji imale mir. Izgrađivale se i hodile u strahu Gospodnjemu, te se množile utjehom Duha Svetoga.
So this is a nice little snapshot of the early church.
Ovo je lijepi slika ili onaj snapshot rane crkve.
It was growing, it was multiplying. That's exciting to hear.
Crkva koja je rasla, koja se umnažala i uvijek je to dobra vijest čuti.
But the reason it was growing is because it was walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Spirit.
Razlog zašto je rasla jeste jer je imala strah Gospodnji i rasla je u sili Duha Svetoga.
So it was a healthy church before it was a growing church.
Bila je prvo zdrava crkva prije nego što je počela rasti kao crkva.
And the goal of all church planting, church revitalization and just regular church is health.
Cilj svake crkve ili zdrave crkve jeste njezino zdravlje, da crkva prvenstveno bude zdrava.
Forget growth.
Zaboravite za trenutak
It's
rast.
it's all about health. If you're healthy, God will take care of the growth.
Sve se vrti oko zdravlja. Ako to imamo na mjestu, sve će biti ok.
And the church in Acts was very healthy and it grew.
I crkva u djelima apostolskim je bila zdrava i ona je rasla.
So we're going to look at three keys to being a healthy church.
Pogledat ćemo 3 ključa koja su potrebna za zdravu crkvu.
There are lots of books and conferences on church and health, right?
Puno knjiga koje možete pročitati o zdravlju crkve.
Some would say there are 4, some would say 7, some would say 9, some
Neki
would
će
say
reći da ima
12.
4, 7, 9, 12 točaka.
3 is about all I can think about. So,
Ali 3 meni padaju na pamet.
so they are good worship,
Dobro štovanje,
good small groups,
dobre male skupine
and good leadership.
i dobro vodstvo.
I'm going to talk first about leadership.
Govorit ćemo prvo o vodstvu.
So 3 questions people are asking when they come to your church.
3 pitanja se ljudi postavljaju kada dolaze u vašu crkvu.
Or if they're considering coming to your church.
Ako uopće uzimaju u obzir dolazak u vašu crkvu.
First, does he have anything to say?
Prvo, ima li pastor, govornik, nešto za reći?
Right? Does the pastor have anything to say? Number 2, can I trust him?
Drugo, mogu li mu vjerovati?
And what's in it for me?
I što ja imam od toga ili što ja dobivam od
So
toga?
let's talk about those 3 questions. Does he have anything to say?
Prvo pitanje, ima li on što za reći?
You have to have a message.
Moraš imati
You
poruku.
have to be able to preach the gospel. You have to be able to make the gospel clear.
Moraš biti sposoban vrlo jasno prenijeti evanđelje.
And you have to make it applicable to their lives.
Da bi ga ljudi znali primijeniti u svojim životima.
You don't have to be a great preacher.
Ne moraš biti veliki
Just
propovijednik.
make the gospel clear and applicable.
Samo pojasni evanđelje i neka ga ljudi mogu primijeniti.
Paul may have been a great preacher.
Pavao je možda bio veliki
I
propovijednik.
would have loved to have heard him.
Rado bi ga čuo.
But he's told the Corinthians, I'm with you in weakness, fear, and trembling.
Ali on je rekao Korinčanima, ja sam među vama u slabostima, u strahu, u drhtanju.
Not in persuasive words of wisdom and oratory.
Nisam došao sa velikim nekakvim govorom, sa vještinama ljudskim.
He just preached the cross.
On je
Preached
jednostavno
Jesus.
propovijedao križ, propovijedao je Isusa.
And people came to Christ.
I ljudi su se obraćali Isusu.
So you have to have a message.
Znači morate imati prvo poruku.
And not just preaching though, you need to have a vision for the church.
Morate također imati viziju za tu crkvu.
You have to be able to communicate with your people what kind of church do we want to be?
Trebaš biti u stanju s ljudima iskomunicirati kakva crkva mi želimo biti.
What kind of church will we be?
Ili kakva ćemo crkva biti.
So you have to have some kind of vision, some kind of desired future for the church.
Nekakva vizija, nekakva želja za crkvu, kako će ona izgledati.
And then you have to be able to give direction. How are we going to become that kind of church?
I onda davati smjernice kako ćemo mi postati ta crkva.
So you have to have some ability to make a plan, a ministry plan, and lead the church in
Moraš
that
biti u
particular
stanju
direction.
razviti nekakav misijski plan kako ćeš crkvu dovesti do određenog cilja.
But that's the first thing. Does he have anything to say?
No, prva točka, imaš li što za reći?
Second question is, can I trust him?
Drugo pitanje, mogu li mu vjerovati?
This is the ability to communicate integrity to your people.
To je sposobnost, cjelovitost ljudima prenijeti.
And I think a critical component to this is, I mean, you can say a lot about integrity, but a critical component is emotional intelligence.
Jedna važna komponenta jeste ta emotivna inteligencija
Or emotional health
ili emotivno zdravlje
on the part of the pastor.
od strane pastora.
And what is that?
Pa da pojasnim.
Well, it's basically the ability to read yourself and read other people.
Kratko rečeno, to je sposobnost da sebe znaš pročitati i da znaš pročitati dobro svoje slušatelje.
You need to know yourself, your strengths and your weaknesses.
Moraš biti svjestan svojih jakosti i svojih slabosti.
We love our strengths, we don't like our weaknesses.
Mi volimo svoje jakosti, ali ne volimo svoje slabosti.
But you have to be aware of what those are.
Ali budi svjestan koje su to u tvojem životu.
And if you're not real sure what your weaknesses are, you need to start asking questions.
Ako nisi siguran koje su tvoje slabosti, počni si postavljati pitanja.
Ask your friends, ask your wife.
Pitaj ženu, pitaj prijatelje.
Ask what your strengths and weaknesses are.
Pitajte ljude koje su tvoje jakosti i koje su tvoje slabosti.
And give thanks for your strengths and embrace your weaknesses.
Zahvaljuj za jakosti i prigrli svoje slabosti.
Paul gloried in his weakness,
Pavao se hvalio svojim slabostima,
which I don't understand.
što ne shvaćam.
I hate my weaknesses.
Ja mrzim svoje slabosti.
But maybe one of these days I'll be able to glory in my weaknesses.
Možda ću jednog dana ja se moći pohvaliti svojim slabostima.
So you can read yourself, you know yourself, but you can also read the people around you.
Morate također biti vješti u čitanju ljudi oko sebe.
How am I coming across? How are people receiving me?
Kako mene ljudi doživljavaju, kako me prihvaćaju.
How are they taking my personality, my leadership style?
Kako im odgovara moja osobnost, moje sposobnosti voditi.
So a pastor has to have a certain sensitivity to the people around him.
Znači, pastor mora biti osjetljiv na ljude oko sebe.
Now you can be oversensitive and overreact to everything that goes on.
Ali moramo paziti da ne budemo previše osjetljivi, da reagiramo na svaku pojavu.
But the other extreme is to be totally insensitive and not care what other people are thinking and feeling about you.
Potpuno s druge strane svega toga da uopće ne osjećaš i ne razumiješ.
So you have to be able to sense an awkwardness perhaps in a conversation or a relationship.
Ako se nešto u razgovoru, u nekom odnosu, nešto nelagodno događa.
And you're just aware of that other person with a look on their face or something about their body language that something you said might have been insensitive or offensive.
Možeš pročitati možda njihov govor tijela ili znači kako su to iznijeli i moraš biti onda osjetljiv na sve to. To je tebi signal.
So if that continues to happen, you need to start asking questions.
Ako se nastavi to događati, onda se počni pitati pitanja.
Did I say something to offend you? Did I say something that was insensitive to
Jesam
you?
ja nešto krivo rekao i da sam te povrijedio?
But that's how you learn. You don't do that with everybody, but the fact that you're willing to ask the question means that you have some emotional intelligence.
To ne radi možda sa svakom osobom, ali činjenica da smo svjesni toga, to govori o našoj emotivnoj inteligenciji.
You're reading yourself, you're reading other people, and you're beginning to understand how to get along with people in your church.
Čitaš sebe, čitaš ljude i onda učiš kako s njima živjeti zajedno.
Now the pandemic was and still is a hard time for pastors.
Zasigurno ova pandemija su teške okolnosti za jednog pastora.
I know of a pastor who in the States during the pandemic preached from his living room on Facebook live stream.
Jedan pastor koga poznajem iz Amerike, on je propovijedao iz svoje dnevne sobe uživo.
In the beginning of the pandemic, there were maybe 200 people listening to the live stream.
I na početku njegov živi prijenos su slušali možda 200-tinjak ljudi.
But two months later, there were only 50.
Ali 2 mjeseca kasnije svega 50-ak ljudi ga je slušalo.
And some of his friends went to him and said, "Are you okay? What's wrong?"
I došli su mu prijatelji i pitali su ga, je sve u redu sa tobom? Što se događa?
Your preaching seems to have changed.
Tvoje propovijedanje kao da se je promijenilo.
Why are you yelling at us?
Zašto vičeš na nas?
You seem angry.
Izgledaš srdito.
And his response was, "You don't know what you're talking about."
A on je rekao, ne shvaćate o čemu
And
govorite.
the numbers continued to stay small.
I dalje su te brojke bile vrlo niske.
He had no awareness of how people were receiving his preaching.
Nije bio svjestan kako ljudi doživljavaju njegovo propovijedanje.
And his leadership in their staff meetings, they were complaining because he was talking down to them.
I njegovo vodstvo u svojem odboru nije bilo dobro jer i on s visoka sprema njima
He
se
was showing
postavljao.
a certain arrogance, a certain insensitivity to their ideas and their concerns about the
Pokazivao je
church.
određenu aroganciju prema njihovim idejama koje su oni iznosili.
And he said, you don't know what you're talking about.
Opet je rekao, vi ne znate
So
o čemu govorite.
we have to be aware
Znači moramo biti svjesni toga.
and we have to care.
I nama treba stati do ljudi.
Part of this emotional intelligence is a humility to acknowledge your weaknesses and take responsibility for your actions.
Dio te emotivne inteligencije da prepoznamo svoje slabosti i da poduzmemo nešto.
You have to be able to admit fault, admit failure,
Trebamo priznati svoj neuspjeh.
and when you failed, ask forgiveness.
I kada doživimo neuspjeh, tražimo oproštenje od ljudi.
You know, you say that's it's bad for your reputation, to do that. But
Rećete možda, pa to je loše za vašu reputaciju i to se ne treba raditi.
on the contrary, it enhances your reputation. You
Baš
gain
suprotno.
credibility and integrity with
Vi
your people.
dobivate na ugledu, na kredibilnosti kod ljudi ako to učinite.
So you have the ability to take responsibility for your actions, take responsibility for your mistakes,
Trebaš preuzeti odgovornost za svoje nedostatke i slabosti
and you resist the temptation to blame other people.
i opireš se činjenici da si sklon druge ljude optužiti za to.
And I've always believed that I may be 5% wrong, they may be 95% wrong
Možda sam
in a
ja
broken
5%
relationship,
u krivu, a oni su 90% u krivu.
but I've got to take care of my 5%.
Ali ja moram voditi brigu o mojih 5%.
And then the pressure kind of shifts
I onda će taj pritisak
to the other person. And hopefully
prevagnuti.
they'll respond as
i
well.
da će ta druga osoba također se odazvati kako treba.
So when our church was 2 years old in Cincinnati,
Kada je naša crkva bila 2 godine stara u državi Cincinnati,
one of my leaders came to me and said, we're leaving the church.
jedan vođa mi je prišao i rekao, mi napuštamo ovu crkvu.
And we were a small church, but we were meeting for worship, and
Bili smo mala crkva, okupljali smo se na štovanje
and I thought we were doing quite well. We were on our way.
i mislio sam da nam dobro ide kao crkvi.
And I said, why are you guys leaving?
I ja ga pitam, zašto odlazite?
He said, it's your poor leadership.
Kaže, pa zbog
You're
tvojeg slabog vodstva.
changing things all the time. You have a different idea, and you can't stick to anything.
Stalno mijenjaš stvari i svoje ideje na ume i ne držiš se čvrsto jedne stvari.
And you make these changes without telling us that you're going to make changes.
I
You just
donosiš te
change.
odluke bez da nama o tome govoriš.
He says this church is very fragile. It may not make it.
Ova crkva je vrlo krhka i ne znam da li će baš uspjeti.
So at that point, my first thought was he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Moja prva pomisao je bila, nema on pojma o čemu govori.
But he was right in a lot of ways.
Ali na mnogo načina on je bio itekako u pravu.
The tendency is to rationalize and say, well, he's just got a different idea. He's got a different philosophy of
Skloni
ministry.
smo racionalizirati i reći, pa on ima neke druge zamisli, druga viđenja.
We don't need him.
Ne treba nam on.
But that's not the right response. Ultimately, he was right, and I had to ask his forgiveness.
Ali to nije pravi odaziv, naravno. I konačno sam morao priznati i tražiti njega za oproštenje.
Yeah, you're right. I have been inconsistent in my leadership,
Imaš
and
pravo.
I've made changes without telling you.
Nisam bio dosljedan u svojem vodstvu i stalno sam donosio promjene.
I'm very sorry. Will you forgive me?
Oprosti mi i hoćeš li me prostiti?
He still left.
Ipak je otišao.
So fast forward to 10 years into the life of the church,
Ajmo malo ubrzati u 10 godina u život rane crkve.
and we're beginning to make a new plan for the next 10 years.
To jest njihove crkve. I počeli smo razvijati nove planove za crkvu.
So I asked some of the elders to make some plans in some various areas of church life.
I zamolio sam starješine da unesu neke promjene u život crkve.
And one of our elders had made an elaborate plan for discipleship.
I jedan starješina izradio je detaljan plan za učeništvo.
Then, and he presented it to our leadership meeting,
I to je nama u vodstvu predstavio.
and everybody thought it was great.
I svi su mislili kako je to divno.
But a couple of months later, things changed, and I changed it.
I za par mjeseci stvari su se promijenile i ja sam tu nešto promijenio.
Things changed in the church, circumstances were different, and I thought his plan was not going to be
Okolnosti u
effective.
crkvi su se promijenili i smatrao sam da to neće biti učinkovito za nas.
So we changed the plan for discipleship. We had another leadership meeting. He asked, why do we change the plan? I said, because things had changed. And ultimately he was offended, and he left the church.
Kada smo mu rekli, on je pitao zašto smo promijenili, ja sam mu pojasnio neke stvari, da skratimo priču i on je konačno otišao.
Now, by that time, I'm 10 years as a pastor.
I već su prošle 10 godine kao pastor u toj
And I
crkvi.
know pretty much everything,
kao-
at 10 years.
Bio sam siguran i kao da znam sve
And I
glede
said,
crkve.
he just doesn't understand.
Ja
I've
sam
got
rekao,
every right to make these changes.
On ne razumije, ja moram ove promjene unijeti.
He should understand
On bi
the
to
need to
trebao
make these
razumjeti.
changes.
Da bi on trebao neke stvari mijenjati.
But I was totally ignorant of how my leadership was affecting him.
I nisam znao kako moje vodstvo utječe na njega.
And so in our uncomfortable meeting where he told me my leadership was inconsistent
U tom
and
neugodnom sastanku gdje mi je rekao kako nisam dosljedan u svojem vodstvu,
ineffective and a poor communicator,
kako loše komuniciram, kako je to sve neučinkovito.
I had to say, you're right.
I morao sam uvijek priznati, pa upravo
And,
si.
I'm sorry, will you forgive me?
Žao mi je, oprosti mi.
He still left.
I on je otišao.
But these are hard lessons.
To su teške životne pouke.
They're hard to take, they're painful,
Teško ih je primiti, bolno.
but it's part of the deal.
Ali to je dio cijelog paketa.
That's how you develop integrity.
Tako razvijamo cjelovitost.
It's emotional intelligence.
To je ta emotivna inteligencija.
Before we get to the next question, last question, two things.
Glede ovog zadnjeg pitanja, dvije stvari.
The healthy pastor follows the crucified Jesus,
Zdravi pastor uvijek slijedi razapetoga Krista,
not the Americanized Jesus.
a ne onog amerikaniziranog
Now,
Isusa.
I'm borrowing some terminology from Pete Scazzaro, who's written some good stuff on emotional health.
Koristim neke stvari od ovog čovjeka što se tiče zdravlja crkve.
He's an Italian-American pastor in New York City,
On je
and
talijanski propovjednik u New Yorku.
has some great stuff on church health and pastoral
Divne
health.
stvari je napisao o zdravlju crkve i rastu crkve.
But he says too many young American pastors are following an Americanized Jesus.
Znači, mnogi pastori u Americi slijede tog amerikaniziranog Isusa.
What is that? Well, they're chasing popularity.
Znači, oni trče za popularnošću,
They're chasing greatness.
trče za nekakvom veličinom,
They're chasing success,
trče za uspjehom
and they're looking for the good life.
i očekuju lagodan život.
They want a big church,
Žele veliku crkvu,
a big salary.
veliku plaću.
They want to write a book before they're 40.
Žele napisati knjigu prije 40.
They want to have a blog.
They
They
don't want
want to have a blog,
Žele imati svoj
thousands
blog,
of followers on
na
social
tisuće
media,
sljedbenika na tim društvenim mrežama
and they want to be on the speaker circuit.
i žele biti stalno u tom krugu javnih govornika.
Now, they won't tell you that, but that's what they're thinking.
Neće vam to oni reći, ali tako razmišljaju.
And Pete says that's why the American church is so unhealthy.
I zato su američke crkve, veli taj pastor, nezdrave.
We're chasing an American version of Jesus,
Trčimo za tom amerikaniziranom vizijom Isusa,
not the biblical version of
a ne
Jesus.
biblijskim viđenjem Isusa.
Jesus rejected popularity.
Isus je odbacio popularnost.
He turned people away.
On je ljude odvraćao.
He says, "Go. He gave them the gospel. He said, "You have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me." And they left.
On im je dao evanđelje, rekao kako se trebaju odreći, uzeti križ svoj i slijediti ga. I oni su se okrenuli.
He was despised and rejected of men.
Bio odbačen, prezren od ljudi.
They wanted to make him king.
Htjeli su od njega načiniti kralja.
Who doesn't want to be king?
Ko ne bi htio biti kralj?
Pastors want to be king.
Pastori žele biti kraljevi.
But Jesus rejected kingship.
Ali Isus je i to odbacio.
He rejected successism.
On je odbacio uspješnost.
That's a belief that success is very important.
To je
Successism.
mišljenje ili razmišljanje da je uspješnost vrlo važna.
He wasn't too concerned about numbers.
Njega nisu brinule brojke.
By any earthly measure, his ministry was a failure.
Prema nekakvim ljudskim gledištima njegova služba bila promašaj.
At the end of 3 years, he had no followers
Nakon 3 godine nije imao sljedbenika,
except a few women and John.
nekoliko žena i apostola Ivana.
He rejected greatness,
Odbacio je
greatnessism.
veličinu.
His view of greatness was being a servant.
Njegov stav na
Said,
veličinu je bio da bude sluga.
the pagans out there, the unbelievers, they lord it over. They enjoy leadership. They enjoy being in charge.
Znači i pogani tako razmišljaju. Oni vole biti na visokim položajima, biti, bi rekli, glavni u svemu.
That's where they find their health,
Tu oni nalaze svoje zdravlje.
but not so among you.
Ali neka ne bude tako među vama.
You want to be great?
Ako želiš biti velik,
You want to go to the top?
želiš biti na vrhu,
You got to go to the bottom.
moraš ići prema dolje.
Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his
Sin
life
čovječji
a ransom for
je
many.
došao da služi i da da svoj život, da otkupi ljude.
And Jesus embraced suffering.
Isus je prigrlio patnju.
He embraced loss and
On je
limitations.
prigrlio gubitak i ograničenja.
He embraced failure and death.
On je prigrlio smrt i neuspjehe.
It wasn't easy, but he welcomed it.
Nije bilo lako, ali je on to prigrlio.
The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.
Sin čovječiji nije imao kamo da polegne svoju glavu,
And he was obedient to death,
ali je bio poslušan do smrti.
even the death of a cross.
Smrti na križu.
That's biblical leadership.
To je biblijsko vodstvo.
It's rejecting the American version of Jesus
To znači
and
odbacivati tu amerikaniziranu verziju Isusa
following the crucified Jesus.
i slijediti razapetoga Krista.
Third question people are asking,
Treće pitanje koje se ljudi postavljaju,
what's in it for me?
što ja
Now,
dobivamo
look,
toga?
look, we know following Christ is not easy.
Mi znamo da slijediti Isusa nije jednostavno.
But people come into church, they do want to know, is there any benefit to being a
Ali
part of
ljudi
this
koji
church?
dolaze u crkvu žele znati imaju li kakve koristi oni time što dolaze u ovu crkvu.
So you have to be able to articulate what are the benefits of coming to this church.
Morate znati ljudima prenijeti koje su blagoslovi koristi ako dolaze u tu crkvu.
So you have to make clear the benefits of the gospel
Koje su blagoslovi koristi od evanđelja
and how the gospel applies to all of life.
i kako se evanđelje odnosi na cjelokupni život.
The gospel applies to where we live, where we work, where we play.
Evanđelje se odnosi na rad, gdje se igramo i gdje živimo.
And you will be a man of God. Your wife will be a woman of God. Your children will follow the Lord. You'll have a good family.
Da budeš Božji čovjek, da znaš voditi ženu, da znaš voditi svoju obitelj, da budeš Božji čovjek u svemu.
You'll develop gifts. You'll have a contribution to make. You will be useful in this church and in your community.
Da budeš koristan u svojem društvu, u svojoj zajednici.
If you will come and be a part of this church, your life will be changed, not by me, but by the power
Ako
of the
budeš
gospel.
dio naše crkve, evanđelje će tebe promijeniti i bit ćeš koristan.
So all that's communicated in your preaching, in your vision, in your
Sve to
direction, your
prenosimo
leadership.
propovjedanjem, sve to prenosimo u tim odnosima i u razgovorima.
And they will happily become a part of that church.
I ljudi će onda vrlo rado biti dio te crkve.
Now, a couple other aspects of leadership I want to touch on before we move
Još
on.
nekoliko činjenica po pitanju vodstva.
A good leader leads and listens.
Dobar vođa, on
Now, pastors,
vodi i on osluškuje.
if you're a pastor, you're a shepherd.
Ako si pastor, onda si
And
pastir.
shepherds lead, feed, and care.
Pastor vodi, on hrani i on skrbi.
They lead their flocks, they feed their flocks, and they care for their flocks.
On hrani svoje stado, on ga vodi i on skrbi o njemu.
In my country, we have too many CEOs running around trying to build their own kingdom.
U našoj zemlji ima previše ovih takozvanih izvršnih
And they don't
izvršnika
care.
koji su okolo i
they don't
žele
care
stalno
about
nešto
their own.
voditi. I njima nije stalo jesu li oni
They're advancing
krivu.
too busy advancing their careers and not caring for the people around them.
previše se brinu o svojim vlastitim karijerama, a ne toliko o ljudima.
The Apostle Peter sinned,
Apostol Petar je
was devastated, repented.
kad je sagriješio, on je se pokajao
Jesus forgave him,
Isus mu je
commissioned
prostio.
him, and said, "What?
i poslao ga i što mu je rekao?
Feed my sheep."
Hrani moje stado, pasi moje stado.
So there's a caregiving role about
Znači,
pastoral leadership.
predana vam je skrb u toj pastoralnoj službi.
But a shepherd is also a leader, so I want to address how the
Ali-
shepherd should lead.
Pastir je također i vođa. Kako treba voditi?
He leads the flock in a particular direction.
On stado vodi u određenom smjeru.
So there are two extremes to avoid in pastoral leadership.
Postoje dvije krajnosti koje bi trebali izbjegavati u tom pastoralnom vođenju.
One is being too far out front,
Da ne trčimo predrudo, daleko ispred ljudi, da nas ne
and the
razumiju.
other is being not out front enough.
A druga jeste da uopće ne vodimo.
So if you're too far out front, you have all kinds of plans and projects, and you are doing a lot of things.
Recimo, ako imaš previše planova, projekata i ti si ispred svojeg stada,
But nobody's really following.
ali niko te ne razumije i niko te ne može slijediti u tome.
You're not having people participate in the ministry that you've called.
Ljudi ne sudjeluju
church
u
too.
toj službi koju ti silno želiš.
So make sure your people are with you. If you have ideas and projects and you're leading the church in a particular way, make sure they're with you.
Pobrini se da tvoje stado, tvoja crkva je s tobom, da te prate u svemu.
And the way you do that is by getting their input and getting their thoughts and their ideas as you
To
present
postižeš tako
things
što
to them.
slušaš njih, dobijaš njihov input, uvid u situaciju i osluškuješ.
So at the end of the day, they want you to lead.
Oni doista žele da ih ti predvodiš.
That's why they've become a member of your flock.
Zato su postali dio tvojeg stada.
They're willing to be part of this flock, and they're willing to let you lead.
Oni su spremni da ih ti vodiš.
But they also want to be heard,
Ali oni žele da ih
and
i čujemo.
you have to listen to them and
Moramo osluškivati.
ask for their input.
Tražiti njihov feedback ili uvid u situaciju.
Now, the other extreme is that you're not out front at all.
A druga krajnost jeste da uopće ne predvodimo.
You're asking other people, what do you think we should do?
Kada pitaš ljude što mislite što bismo trebali raditi,
And they're saying, no, wait a minute. You should be telling us what to do.
čekaj malo, pa ti nama moraš reći što trebamo raditi.
And you're going to get their ideas. You're going to share your ideas. You're going to get theirs, and you're going to go together to where the church needs to go.
Ti podijeliš s njima svoju viziju i svoje planove i onda poslušaš njih i onda ćete zajedno otići kamo trebate.
So you can't be too far out front,
Znači ne smiješ
nor
trčati predaleko,
can you not be out front at all.
a moraš biti
You
kao
have
vođa ispred njih da ih vodiš.
to be out front, set vision, set direction, get their input.
Znači
Let's go.
trebaš postaviti smjernice, moraš voditi,
Let's go
dobiti
together.
njihov input i krenuti zajedno.
Many of you know the name Tim Keller.
Mnogi poznajete ovo ime Tim Keller.
Tim's famous for his writings and his theology and
On
his
je
philosophy of
poznat
ministry.
po svojem pisanju, po svojoj teologiji
Tim
i
is-
filozofiji za službu.
Tim has always been a solid pastor.
Uvijek je bio solidan pastor.
And in the beginning, when he planted the church in New York in 1989,
U početku kad je utemeljio crkvu u New Yorku, 89.
he gathered a core of leaders around him, and they had leadership meetings talking about what kind of church we want for New
Okupio
York
vođe
City.
oko sebe i razgovarali su kakva crkva želimo biti. I razgovarali su o tome.
And Tim had a lot of ideas. He's a visionary, he's a great leader,
Bio vizionar, bio veliki vođa,
but he asked them for their input.
ali je tražio i njihov doprinos, uvid.
And so they've had these meetings, and everybody's giving input.
I dok su imali sastanak, dok su svi davali svoje ideje,
And Tim would either at the end of the meeting or he'd go home and send everybody an email.
on bi na kraju tog sastanka ili kada je otišao kući, kada je svima poslao mail,
And he said, here's what I heard at this meeting.
ovo je što sam ja čuo.
Here's what I heard you say, and here's what I heard you say,
Ovo ste rekli za ovo ste rekli za ovo.
and here's what I think we ought to do.
Evo što ja mislim da trebamo učiniti.
So he listened, and he
Slušao je.
made the decision.
I donio odluku.
And that's what they want you to do.
I to oni očekuju od vas.
Listen
Slušaj
and lead.
i vodi.
I worked for Randy Pope in Atlanta for
Radio
12
sam
years.
Čovjeka Randy Popa, 12 godina.
Randy was my mentor as a pastor.
On je bio moj mentor dok sam
Once
postao
again,
pastor.
a great leader, visionary,
Veliki vođa, vizionar,
creative,
vrlo kreativan u svojim pristupima
and built a big church.
i izgradio je veliku crkvu.
And to Randy's credit and to Tim's, they both remained humble.
I Randy i Tim koje sam spomenuo su ostali uvijek u svojoj službi jako ponizni ljudi.
But Randy was a good model for me.
Međutim, Randy je bio dobar uzor za mene.
I knew he had all kinds of great ideas about where he wanted to take the church.
Znao sam da uvijek ima dobre ideje kako crkvu odvesti kam treba.
But if just one of the elders had a question or a concern,
Međutim, jedan starješina uvijek iznosio nekakve zabrinutosti.
He would not run over. He would not push through that.
On, what do you mean by that?
He didn't run over. He didn't ignore. He didn't push through, run over them. I don't know.
Da. Pope nije nikada to zanemario njegov prigovor ili komentar.
In other words, he waited. He was patient.
Uvijek je čekao.
You know, he was very persuasive, and not everybody was persuaded.
I bio je uvjerljiv i ima tu sposobnost.
So if he had a good idea and he felt like this is where we ought to go, but not everybody was with him, he waited. He was patient.
Uvijek je bio strpljiv,
He
čak i u
didn't,
trenucima kada svi možda nisu bili za određenu stvar.
he didn't push his agenda.
On nije svim snagama to gurao.
He waited a while, and then at the end of the period, everybody got on board,
On
typically.
je bio strpljiv, pričekao je i kada su svi bili na istoj, bi rekli, stranici, onda su zajedno krenuli.
So listen to input.
Doista vas ohrabrujem da osluškujete
If,
doprinos ljudi, input ljudi.
if your leaders think you're crazy, you probably are.
Ako ljudi misle da ste ludi, onda vjerojatno jeste.
If your leaders think you preach too long, you probably do.
Ako vaše vođe u crkvi misle da dugo propovjedate, vjerojatno dugo propovjedate.
If your wife thinks you're crazy, you probably are.
Ako žena misli da si sulud, onda vjerojatno jesi.
So you have to listen, but you have to lead.
Trebaš slušati, ali trebaš i voditi.
All right, we're going to leave leadership and talk about worship briefly.
Idemo od vodstva na štovanje kratko.
Healthy churches have really good worship.
Zdrave crkve imaju doista dobro štovanje.
It's a priority. Worship is really your highest value. I've been talking like leadership is your highest value. Worship is your highest value.
Znači, ne samo da je vodstvo vaša najviša vrijednost, također je i štovanje najviša vrijednost.
The largest section in the Bible is right in the middle. It's called the Psalms,
Psalmi su usred Biblije
and it's our worship directory.
i to je naša pjesmarica za štovanje.
John Piper famously said, missions exist because worship does not, right?
Misija postoji
So
zašto
we
je
do
postoji štovanje.
missions to get people to worship our great God.
Mi radimo službu i misiju da bi ljudi štovali.
People's greatest need, John Stott says,
John
is
Stott je rekao
for
da najveća potreba ljudi je
transcendence,
transcendentalnost.
a connection to something bigger than yourself.
Povezanost sa nečim što je mnogo veće od nas samih.
And that's why people connect to their sports teams, their
I
political
zato se ljudi
parties,
toliko
whatever.
identificiraju sa svojim klubovima, sa političkim strankama i tako
Everybody
dalje.
wants to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Svi želimo biti dio nečega što je mnogo veće od nas.
And worship is the biggest thing they can connect to.
A štovanje je ta najveća stvar s kojom se oni mogu povezati.
In worship, we connect to the God of the universe.
U štovanju mi se povezujemo sa Bogom svemira.
And that meets the greatest need of your people.
I to će namiriti te najveće potrebe ljudi.
So make worship your highest priority in your
Neka
ministry.
štovanje bude vaš najviši prioritet.
What are the goals of worship?
Koji su ciljevi štovanja?
Let's look at 1 Corinthians 14, 23 through 26.
1.
1 Corinthians
Korinčanima
14.
14. poglavlje
Yep, 1 Corinthians 14, 23, 26.
od 23. do 26. stiha. 1. Korinčanima poslanica, 14. poglavlje, od 23. do 26. stiha. Including verse 26?
Yep. Mhm.
Ako se dakle sva crkva skupi zajedno i svi govori jezicima, a uđu neupućeni ili nevjernici, neće li reći da mahnitate? Ako pak svi prorokuju, a uđe koji nevjernik ili neupućeni, svega prekorava, svega prosuđuje. Te se tako očituje tajna njegova srca. Tako će pasti ničice i pokloniti se Bogu, razglašujući da je Bog doista među vama. Što dakle, braćo, kad se sastajete, svaki od vas ima psalam, ima učenje, ima jezik, ima otkrivenje, ima tumačenje, sve neka bude na izgradnju.
So this gives us a window into New Testament worship.
To nam daje jedan prozor, jedan pogled u novozavjetno štovanje.
Worship exists for the glory of God. We see that
Štovanje
here.
postoji radi slavljenja Božeg imena.
People fall on their faces, worship God, declare that God is really among you. That's really what you want in your worship
Vi
service.
želite da ljudi padnu ničice i da se poklone Bogu i da razglašuju njegova slavna djela.
You want that sense of God's presence where people are awestruck.
Vi želite Božju prisutnost gdje su ljudi doista oduševljeni njime.
And they want to fall down and worship him and say, God is here.
Gdje su oni spremni pasti ničice i reći Bog je ovdje.
So it's for the glory of God.
Sve za Božju slavu.
Second, worship is for the building up of the believer.
Štovanje postoji da bi se vjernik izgradio.
And we see in verse 26, this early church worship was highly participative.
Rana crkva je bila jako uključena u štovanju.
Everybody's prepared. Not everybody necessarily is going to get up and sing a song or whatever, but everybody's ready and there is response and there is
Svi su
participation.
bili spremni, možda nisu svi imali istu ulogu, ali svi su bili spremni i sudjelovali su.
Let all things be done for building up the believer.
Neka sve bude na izgradnju vjernika.
So, in your preaching, in
U
your
svojem
worship service,
propovijedanju, u svojem štovanju,
it's the glory of God
Božja slava
and the building up of the believer.
i izgradnja vjernika.
And the third is
A
the
treće,
reaching of the lost.
da
Preaching the
dohvatimo
gospel to the
izgubljene
lost.
ljude.
So here he's talking about speaking in tongues, and we're not going to do that here, of
On
course.
govori ovdje o govoru jezicima, to nećemo sad ovdje tumačiti.
But the point being, he's talking about outsiders being there.
On govori ovdje o ljudima izvana koji su prisutni na takvom jednom bogosluženju.
If an unbeliever or outsider enters,
Nevjernik dođe i neko sa strane,
and he's assuming they should be there. They ought to be there. Unbelievers and outsiders ought to be in your worship service.
oni bi također trebali biti prisutni tu.
And he's saying, make sure in that worship service that it's intelligible.
Pobrinite se da to sve bude razumno.
Make sure that if you're going to speak in tongues, follow the rules, but make sure
Ako ćete
people understand what
govoriti
you're
u jezicima,
saying.
držite se pravila. Neka ljudi doista razumiju što se događa.
Far better to prophesy,
Mnogo je bolje prorokovati,
to teach the word, to preach.
poučavati riječ, propovjedati.
That's when people will fall on these unbelievers will fall on their face and worship God and declare,
Ti
God
nevjernici
is
će
real,
pasti
God is
ničići i
here.
onati štovati Boga i reći će pa Bog je doista ovdje prisutan.
So preach the gospel.
Propovijedajte evanđelje.
And the gospel does that. The gospel brings glory to God. It
To
builds
čini.
up the believer
Ono donosi slavu Bogu, ono izgrađuje vjernika
and it reaches the lost.
i doseže ili dohvaća nevjernika.
Now some people have an idea that the gospel is just for the beginning.
Neki misle da je evanđelje samo ono za sve nas na početku.
It saves us and after that
To nas spasi i
we
onda
just preach scripture and apply it to our lives.
propovijedamo riječ i to primjenjujemo u naš život.
No, the gospel saves us
Evanđelje
in the middle.
nas spašava i u sredini naših života
and at the end.
i na kraju naših života.
It's the power of the gospel to salvation saves us in the beginning and the middle.
Moć evanđelja
all the way to
nas
the end.
spašava na početku, u sredini i na kraju.
Uh-huh. Okay, I thought I lost my note. Technology. Talk about a quick note about style, worship style, contemporary,
kratka
traditional,
opaska
old,
o
new.
Stilu štovanja, stari način, novi način, tradicionalan, modern i tako dalje.
Worship should be connected to your past, style of worship connected to the past, but also contemporary to the present.
Znači, štovanje treba biti povezano sa vašom i prošlošću i sadašnjošću.
Ephesians 5 and Colossians 3 talk about
Efežanima
psalms
5,
and
Kološanima
hymns
3,
and spiritual songs,
Da
right?
govorimo o jednim drugim o psalmima, pjesmama, hvalospjevima.
Psalms and hymns, that's the old music.
Znači, psalmi i himne, to su
Spiritual
stara
songs,
glazba.
spiritual songs, that's the new music.
Duhovne pjesme, to je
Psalm
novi stil.
says, sing a new song to the Lord.
Pjevamo novu pjesmu
And
Gospodinu.
every time the Lord does a new work, we ought to be writing music.
I svaki put kada Bog nešto novo čini u našem životu, trebamo napisati novu pjesmu.
And you guys do a great job of that.
I vama to odlično ide.
So, 3 goals in worship, glory of God, edification of the
Tri cilja
believer,
u štovanju jeste
reaching
slava
the lost
Božja,
with the gospel,
izgradnja vjernika i dohvaćanje nevjernika.
connected to the past, contemporary to your culture.
Glazba treba biti povezana sa našom prošlošću i sa našom sadašnjošću.
That's pretty good worship.
I to je doista dobro štovanje.
And if worship is your highest priority,
Ako je štovanje vaš najviši prioritet,
you will give it prime time,
onda ćete mu dati ono najbolje mjesto u vašem životu
prime resources.
i svoje najbolje resurse koji su na raspolaganju.
You'll try to get your best people involved in worship
Uključit ćete svoje najbolje ljude u štovanju.
that are gifted musicians in singing and speaking, just
Nadarenije
because
ljude u sviranju, u govoru.
God's name is excellent and you want your worship to be
Jer
excellent.
Božje ime je izvrsno i tako ga želimo štovati.
Finally,
Konačno.
keys, final third key.
Treća
And I'm
točka.
punching all the wrong buttons here. Is good small groups.
Imati zdrave ili dobre male grupe,
Ne.
male skupine.
You may think they're coming because they love you,
Mislite nekada da oni dolaze zbog vas,
but they really want friends.
ali u biti svi ljudi žele prijatelje.
They're coming to your church for a lot of reasons, but one of the top reasons is they want and need friends.
Dolaze iz više razloga u tvoj crkvu, ali jedan od glavnih razloga, ljudi trebaju prijatelje.
They want people they can share their life with,
Oni žele ljude s kojima mogu podijeliti svoj život,
pray with,
s kim se mogu moliti,
celebrate big events with,
proslavljati velike životna događanja,
eat with, and
s njima žele jesti
have fun with.
i zabavljati.
So if you're a larger church, you should break down your church membership
Ako
into
ste velika
smaller
crkva,
groups.
onda bi trebali vašu crkvu podijeliti u manje skupine.
And train the leaders a little bit, give them some basics on how to ask good questions and how to lead a
Osposobljavati
small
vođu
group.
koji će znati postavljati dobra pitanja, koji će znati voditi te male skupine.
And the participation should be around the word, prayer, fellowship, and meals.
I svi
Basically.
trebaju imati udjela oko učenja, čitanja riječi u zajedništvu, oko objeda.
If you're a smaller church and your church itself is a small group,
Ako imate malu crkvu, i brojčano malu,
just have lots of social events.
onda možete imati puno tih društvenih
Lots of
događanja
get-togethers where people can see each other
gdje se
outside
ljudi
of worship
mogu
and
vidjeti izvan okvira štovanja.
play together, eat together,
Mogu
sing
jesti.
together.
Pjevati,
Yeah.
igrati se i tako dalje.
Much we could say about small groups, but
Puno se toga može reći o tim malim grupama,
these are the three keys that have served me well.
ali to su te tri
For a long
točke
time.
koje su meni jako bile korisne.
Good worship,
Dobro štovanje,
good small groups,
dobre male grupe
good
i
leadership.
dobro vodstvo.
Remember, it's health.
Imamo u umu da se radi o zdravlju crkve.
Growth will take care of itself.
Rast će se sam pobrinuti onda za sebe.
God will take care of your growth.
I Bog će se brinuti za rast vaše crkve.
But this kind of church is pretty attractive to people outside.
Ali trebamo biti privlačni ljudima oko nas.
Okay, that's it.
To je to. Amen.
Questions? Any questions about
Možda da
anything?
otvorimo
I
za par
thought
pitanja
this is
samo.
more of a seminar than a sermon, so maybe
Više
a question or
semina
two.
nego poruka bila, ali ako imate neko žurno
Maybe
pitanje,
you think I'm crazy.
možda mislio sam lud
We talk about that.
da o svemu tome govorim.